Hi everyone, this is Gleb Bahmutov, a Senior Director of Engineering at Mercari US. Thank you so much to React Finland for inviting me today to speak about integration testing for React Native apps. If you want to follow my work, find me at gleb.dev. So you want to write a mobile app, right? No problem, you just learn how to code for iOS using Xcode. Maybe you learn Android programming and half a year later you start making an app, right? No. So if you want to write a mobile application, I suggest today you learn React. You probably already know React because you're watching this talk. But once you learn React, you install React Native library, which will allow you to write a React application, convert it into mobile applications, upload it to the store, and use it like normal apps, because they are normal apps. And once you do that, it's all profit. Now, a lot of companies have already converted their native mobile applications to React Native platform. In fact, this icon is Mercari US. We have publicly announced that we have retired our mobile applications and that we are replacing them with React Native project. You can learn our reasoning in the blog post. In the future, we even plan to maybe share some of the code for React Native mobile platform with React UI code we're using for our React web app. But that's a future plan. So here's a typical React Native application. Notice it looks a lot like your React web application, only instead of using divs and paragraphs to show content on the screen, you use tags, view, and other widgets from React Native third-party package. Other than that, it's pretty standard application, right? You import components, your logic, and just use it. You can create other components that use other React Native parts, but other than that, it's standard React. All those components will be translated into the presentation elements on each mobile platform. You can even write code that, depending on the platform, can use different code paths and different source files. For example, the header can be implemented in header.android and header.ios.js. And depending on the platform, React Native will use the right file. The big question here is, are you sure your application is working? If you go to React Native documentation, under the testing page, the first line of defense to answer this question will be use ESLint and static checks using Flow or TypeScript. Makes sense. For unit tests, they suggest using Jest with Jest DOM and a special React Native renderer. Okay, you can write some component tests to make sure, yeah, the header is there. But to test the full application, the suggestion is to use end-to-end test tool that actually works with converted, exported mobile application like Detox and Appium. Now, nothing against those tools, but the workflow is kind of slow, and those tools have no visibility into your application. Here's a middle ground, or a middle way. If you take React Native application, you can export it not to the mobile platform, but for the browser, for the web platform. The very popular tool Expo does just that. It can take your React Native app, convert it to the mobile, or show it in a browser. If you can show your app in a browser, you can use something like Cypress test runner to test that application running on a URL. Now, full disclosure, I used to work for Cypress. I love it as a tool, so that's what I'm going to use in this presentation. One thing about Expo. Expo is a super nice tool. All the code examples at React Native Dev site are using Expo to show it right away, and you can modify it. Here, I'm modifying and replacing some of the text, and it immediately uses hot module replacement to show the result in the browser. Here's a typical React Native application. I'm going to import React and its hooks from standard React library. I'm going to import activity indicator and all the representational components from React Native. I can fetch the data using the hook and the standard fetch mechanism. I can handle the data and set it, or I can handle the errors And I can create a view that will show the loading indicator if isLoading is true. Otherwise, it will show the loaded list of users. I'm iterating through the list and I'm creating text items. Now let's write a test. This is a very simple Cypress test. I'm going to visit the URL and I'm going to look for elements with data test attributes equals user and make sure that there are more than 3 items there. Now, I don't know exact number, but I assume there is more than 3 users. Now, this assumes that Expo translates the React Native application into something that's equivalent and runs on the web, iOS, and Android. And I do believe for most cases, this is true. Now, we're going to configure Cypress to look at localhost 19,006, which is default port when Expo is serving the application. And here's our app being tested. The application behaves just like a normal app. It fetches the list, it shows it on a page, and we're confirming that those items really are present. Now, we don't know how many items will be fetched from the server, so how can we spy on a network call to actually know the number of users to expect? Cypress has this intercept command that can set up a network spy. We save it as an ls users. Then we're going to visit the page and we'll wait for this network call to happen. We'll get its response body and check if it's an array and if there are more than 5 users in that array. And then we're going to look at the DOM and make sure that the number of users displayed is equal to the number of users in the response from the server. And here's how it looks. You can see the UI for everything the Cypress does. You can debug it easier. And whenever you change the code, immediately the application is re-rendered and you can rerun the test. What about the loading indicator itself? While application is fetching the data, is displaying the loading activity indicator. Well, again, take intercept command. It has capability of taking the response, delaying it by, let's say, in this case, 1 second, and then allowing it to continue. We're going to visit the page and we're going to check that the loading indicator is displayed. Then we're going to check if it disappears because the data should come back after 1 second. And here's how it runs. And this is a recording. Again, for 1 second, you see the spinner, and then it disappears, and the users are displayed. You don't want to rely on the backend to always return you the data. Sometimes you want to return a very specific response. Cypress allows you to respond with a fixture. The fixture is loaded from a JSON file and is substituted as a response. So the app doesn't go all the way to the server, but it thinks it does. So in this case, we're going to respond with a fixture that contains 3 users, and we're going to confirm that 3 users is displayed on the page. Even difficult logical paths, for example, unhappy path. What does your application do when it hits an error? In our case, it just prints a message to cancel error. We can test this by forcing the reply with a network error using intercept, checking and stubbing or spying on cancel error method, and then confirming that once the loading indicator goes away, that the log error method was really called. Whatever your application does when it hits a network error, we can confirm right there in Cypress test. Nice. The application should be accessible. So before that, I use data test IDs because everything else, all the classes and all the attributes, the generation is controlled by React Native, and those stylings are all dynamic. I cannot select elements using that. But you can also specify area hints and attributes when you're writing React Native app. In fact, it's a good idea. And then you can use those accessibility labels that will be translated into data area label and data area hints, right? Attributes, so that you can select something like this. Get elements by area label equals app is loading users. Should be visible, right? Instead of using test IDs. So those area labels will also be generated in the mobile app. So anyone using a reader to interact with the app can also interact with the application. Again, select the elements using area labels. This is just scratching the surface. If you want full accessibility check, you can bring a Cypress X plugin. And anytime you want to check the whole page, you can say check accessibility. This plugin will find so many issues, I guarantee it. Everything from color contrast to a lack of labels to the structure of your document. Now, did we just test everything, right? I showed a couple of tests. We probably covered some of them, but maybe not. So the way we can confirm that we truly tested our React Native application is by adding code instrumentation while it's running in the browser. The React Native application, when it runs in the browser, is transpiled. It's transpiled using Babel. What else, right? So we can insert the plugin, Istanbul, which will instrument the code, and then we can use standard Cypress code coverage plugin to generate reports. The generate report in our case will show that yes, everything inside app.js application code or any components that it uses locally has been instrumented and covered by the end-to-end tests. Another question that comes up, does my application look good? Now, the computers cannot answer that. But what they can answer very, very well, does your application look the same as before? Did you accidentally change something? So did you shift the styling? Did you, cover one element with another? So for this, you can use any visual plugin that Cypress supports, right? And the way it looks, for example, when you use Cypress Percy plugin is once in a while when you interact with a page, after you confirm that it has the information rendered, you say Cypress snapshot and give it a name. And let's say we change something. Let's say we made a pull request that actually improves accessibility of those buttons and the completed text. They have a much higher contrast now. Now the visual plugin will compare those two images pixel by pixel and will tell you, hey, this particular area marked in red have changed. Do you approve it or not? And the developer can review this and say, yeah, that's what I meant to do. This is a good change. Approve it, and this image will become the new baseline. And all our test runs will be compared against the approved baseline. And the big question, $1 million question is, does this work? The assumption is the Expo generates a browser-compatible web app and runs it, showing to you how your application would behave and act on iOS and Android. And honestly, I trust it. Expo seems like a very good tool that truthfully generates a representation of your app that behaves just like it would on mobile device. It's used by a lot of projects already, and I trust that library a lot more than I trust my own code that I'm writing for the first time. I think that by testing the Expo browser version of my app, I'll find all the errors that creep up in my logic, in my data, coming from the backend errors are also tested. So I actually trust it to discover all the issues, right, that would not be discovered otherwise. And again, there are parts of application that cannot be rendered in the browser. All, let's say, native components that don't have a representation inside the browser cannot be tested by running the app in the browser. In that case, I think those parts can be stopped and marked from your code, right? And for those features, you should really write something using a detox or RPM test, okay? But I think 90% of your application can successfully be tested while the application is running in the browser before it gets exported and converted into the native mobile application. Thank you very much for listening. I put the slides online. I put all the descriptions of all the testing techniques for React Native in a browser under a couple of blog posts tagged React Native. If you have any questions, reach out. I'm on Twitter, and thank you and have a great rest of your day.
That was awesome as well. How are you feeling? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. It's always difficult listening to yourself,
Oh yeah, I know that. If you're
Trick is constant exposure. Just have yourself in the background.
It's not, yeah, it's just so awkward. And you always listen and you're like, why am I such an idiot? We have two questions from the audience in this call right now. And who wants to go first? Caddy, you can go first. Yes.
Sure. I mean, the question that I had, like, I typed out my question, but then, like, in the last slide, you kind of answered it. So, I mean, the way that React Native and, well, also Expo works is that you have your JavaScript code and there are mappings to iOS. So someone has gone like, okay, if you type in Vue, here is the native Vue on iOS that, like, you will use. And then in a completely different file in a code base, there's the equivalent to Android and equivalent to web. So that's why you can have like three approaches. So personally, I've never used React Native to actually build a web app. Obviously, I've seen the demo on Expo Web, but I've used Expo and plain React Native, but I only build iOS and Android apps. So in this approach, we're testing the web version of this mapping. So do you think there's enough value in that, like enough confidence? Like, would you use this approach to testing even if you're actually never using Expo Web?
100% or 90%, right?
90%.
Right. So here's an example. I mean, we all say we're writing web applications, we're writing mobile application. We're writing something that fetches data from the server, shows it to the user, and processes button clicks by sending it back to the server. Like we glorify data processors, right? And we write apps. So in my example, I'm fetching the list of users, showing it on a page, on a mobile screen, right? So the question is, if I'm testing that my application running using Expo in a browser is really fetching the list of users and really showing on a page, right? Do I trust it that when I run it on a mobile device, that it will fetch list of users and show it on a mobile device, right? Now, where is the error? The error could be that Expo doesn't implement fetch the same way, right? It could actually completely screw it up, right?
Mm.
But I guarantee that probably when I write this application, my error will not be in an Expo code. It will be I put a wrong URL, right, to fetch the users, right? It will fail in a web version and in a mobile version, right? Majority, I think, in my errors is how do I fetch the data, how I display, how I use React hooks, how I map props, how I handle the state updates, right? All these things will manifest itself in the web version, right? And so if I test that fully and then export into mobile device, I think all the logical errors that I tested will not be present on a mobile version, right? I'm happy to be proven wrong. And if you have an example where, hey, here's an app, it looks to be fine, right, in a web version, but completely is broken right here in a mobile version, I'll be happy, to look at this, right?
Yeah.
But so far, aside from like a few things, right, that really just are native code and cannot be run in the browser, I think it works pretty much the same way.
So just one follow-up question, sorry.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what's the benefit then of using this browser-based testing versus just using unit tests and snapshot tests?
Right. It gives you a whole view of how your application flow works when the user exercises it, right? Where you go to the server, you fetch items, and then they're rendered. I don't care how they implement it, right? So for me, it's only like, hey, the application is loading and shows the users. I don't care how many components there are. I don't care if it uses, set state or some kind of hooks, right? I'm testing the user flow rather than component implementation under the hood. So to me, that's a great value. And the speed, right? Compared to exporting to mobile application, launching the emulator, testing it using Appium. This is instant, right? Expo, hot module reloading, Cypress just watches the files, reruns it. And I have full browser DevTools, right? So people love using the browser DevTools to interact with the application and debug, especially during testing. That's why even in Node, right, you use the inspect breakpoint and you open DevTools. So having that for my mobile application in React Native, where you can install like React DevTools plugin, is absolutely incredible experience in my view.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I have a related question. Is it, since you can run React Native applications through Expo, can we use Vidshot to test them now?
So almost. So with this shot, from what I understand, and Francois, feel free to jump in to correct me. The vid shot, the beauty of it is that it actually renders your components yourself. When you run React Native using Expo, the Expo is the bundler, right? It renders the full application. Now, what I've done recently was when you run it in a browser using Cypress, you can actually grab the static DOM snapshot, right? Because it's already rendered during the test at each step. So you can grab it, and then if you have Playwright or Puppeteer standing by somewhere, right, you can just fed it and tell it, give me the image back. So once you have image, you can actually use image comparison tools. And like Francois was talking about Vidshot as a service to minimize cross-platform differences, because if I do it on Mac and then you do it on CI on Linux, or you are using Windows, all these screenshots will be different. That's why I use third-party service like Percy, right? You can actually run your Puppeteer or Playwright as a service, let's say on AWS, and just take the DOM, right, the whole tree with styles, but no JavaScript because it's already been rendered by your test runner, and send it off, get back an image, and compare it. So it's almost like the most beneficial would be use Vidshot as a service rather than Vidshot itself to generate the DOM.
All right, thank you.
We have one question on YouTube, which is, what's the ratio you think you should have between like end-to-end integration and unit tests?
Okay, that's a great question. So the way I look at React Native, the true end-to-end would be the detox or RPM test on a mobile device, right? So what I'll call those Cypress tests running in a browser, I call them integration tests, because we integrated all the bunch of stuff, but we didn't really test the app. So I would call it integration. Now, then the question is how many of end-to-end integration or, just unit tests for React Native platform would you have? To me, the value is in testing what the user sees, right? Loading applications, seeing the loading indicator, like going through the story. So I would actually write more integration tests than unit tests. If I have a very hairy component, probably unit tests for that. But majority of my tests are integration. And for end-to-end, the true RPM or detox test at the end of the day would be just a few sanity checks for things I cannot cover with integration. So it's not a pyramid for me where it will be like unit, integration, end-to-end. It's almost like a diamond, right? Where a few unit tests, majority integration tests, and a few end-to-end tests using actual mobile test framework.
Does anyone have any other opinions, ideas on this? I think my only thing is that go, Kari. Yeah.
I was just going to say I definitely write fewer tests than I should. My go-to tends to be not writing React component tests because components change way too often, and I don't like snapshot tests because of the reason that Francois you mentioned that it's difficult to assess. Like, yes, the class name changed, but what does that mean? So I tend to write unit tests for complex functions. So if there's a function that has like lots of business logic, or I'm adding like a spacer for a credit card input, and like it's complicated, needs to handle Amex and Visa, I'd write tests for that, and that tends to be most of my tests.
Yeah,
some end-to-end. I need to like add some end-to-end tests, so I'm gonna definitely try your approach, Gleb, and see if that works.
Francois?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the thing that people don't talk about enough when it comes to testing is the return on investment. And for example, it really depends whether you work in a bigger team or in a smaller team. In a smaller team, you don't necessarily need as many tests, whereas in a bigger team, there are many more risks of other people breaking your things. So that might be more worth writing tests. As well, if you have, again, a lot of business logic, definitely you should be adding tests, not just for other potentially breaking your code, but also for yourself breaking your code, because that happens more often than you think. But if it's just something simple, maybe you do want to have some vidshot tests, because that's super easy to write and it just takes a couple of seconds. But you don't need unit tests for something simple, because the code is going to be just as complicated as the test.
Yeah, I do tend to agree. I think that a lot of the times when we test React components, we're actually testing React instead of actually testing what we build. Like at my current job, we usually test the entirety of the page. Like, does it get this data? Does it show the data? Can you filter this data when you type on it? So it ends up kind of being more of an integration test than a unit test, because in the end, React tests itself, I guess. I think React has enough tests and React Native has enough tests.